You must understand, my friends, that when the empath reclaims their power, something profound and nearly alchemical occurs in the invisible architecture of the psyche. Attraction itself, that mysterious magnetic field between souls, begins to rearrange its laws. It recalibrates not according to desire or longing or fear, but according to the inner orientation of the self. Many believe that attraction is merely an outer dance between two personalities. But I tell you, it is first and foremost an inner realignment of psychic energy. The empath is a being whose sensitivity has made them porous, open, susceptible to emotional currents that most human beings barely register. They have spent most of their lives, often unconsciously, shaping themselves around the needs, wounds, projections, and shadows of others, and so their attraction patterns have historically been determined not by their will, but by their wounds. When the empath begins to reclaim their power, they do not simply become stronger. No, that is far too superficial an interpretation. What happens is a return to the center they abandoned long ago, often in childhood, when they learned that love must be earned, peace must be negotiated, and safety must be purchased through self-erasure. The empath becomes powerful not because they learn to resist others, but because they begin to inhabit the truth of who they are beneath the layers of adaptation. This reclamation is not loud, it is not dramatic, it is quiet, like the dim light of dawn spreading across the horizon of a long-forgotten landscape. It emerges slowly, as though the psyche itself is remembering a secret it buried and promised never to reveal, and in that remembering, something ancient awakens. Attraction responds to this awakening instantly, not because anything external has changed, but because the inner frequency of the empath shifts so dramatically that the world must reorganize around it. It is as though the empath stops sending out a distress signal and begins broadcasting a signal of sovereignty. The psyche, in all its mystery, begins to choose differently, to feel differently, to reach differently, to draw differently. The types of souls once magnetized to the empath begin to lose their pull, for they were attracted not to the empath's essence, but to their unhealed vulnerability. When that vulnerability transforms into grounded selfhood, the entire relational ecosystem changes. You see, the unconscious governs more of our lives than the ego dares to admit. And for the empath, whose unconscious is rich with archetypal imagery, mythic memory, and ancestral echoes, the inner world has always shaped their relationships with far more intensity than they consciously realized. Many empaths come to me and say, why do I keep attracting the same type of person? Why do I keep finding myself entangled with the same wound? They assume it is fate. They assume it is punishment. But I tell them it is repetition. Repetition created by the psyche's attempt to resolve what remains unintegrated. The empath often carries the archetype of the healer, the sage, the guide, or even the martyr without knowing it. These archetypes pull them toward those who mirror back their unhealed story, not to trap them, but to offer them a chance to rewrite it. Yet the moment the empath steps into their reclaimed power, the entire dynamic collapses. The archetype shifts from the wounded healer to the sovereign healer, from the unconscious mediator to the conscious alchemist. And when that shift takes place, the kinds of souls that once clung to their energy, they begin to lose access, not because the empath pushes them away, but because the psychic contract that once bound them simply expires. The empath stops offering the emotional currency that enabled these patterns to survive, and so attraction recalibrates. It becomes cleaner, clearer, more refined, more aligned with the self rather than the shadow of the self. There's a dream I once interpreted for a patient who embodied this empathic journey. She dreamed she was walking through a forest at dusk, carrying a lantern so dim it barely illuminated the path. She felt watched, surrounded by unseen beings that seemed to draw closer each time she grew anxious. The more she doubted her ability to navigate the darkness, the more intense their presence became. Suddenly, she felt the urge to open the lantern, not to add fuel, but to let something out. When she did, a brilliant light burst forth, scattering every shadowy figure into mist. They did not run, they dissolved, and she woke with a sense of profound clarity. This dream encapsulates the empath's reclamation of power. The beings watching her were not external enemies, but internal shadows, representations of her fears, projections, insecurities, and the unconscious parts of her identity that had long dictated her attractions. The lantern symbolized her inner light, the self she had kept hidden to avoid overwhelming others, or perhaps to avoid confronting herself. When she opened it, when she stopped dimming herself, when she allowed her essence to expand naturally, the shadows disappeared, not from force but from illumination. So too does the empath's relational life transform when they stop negotiating their worth. The empath's magnetism has always been powerful, but when it is rooted in unhealed wounds, it draws in those who feed on that vulnerability. When it becomes rooted in reclaimed sovereignty, it begins to draw in those who resonate with their authenticity. Attraction becomes a mirror of inner alignment. But one must understand, this shift can feel destabilizing at first. The empath may suddenly find themselves disinterested in those they once felt drawn to. They may feel a sudden repulsion toward dynamics they previously tolerated. They may feel a sense of grief as old patterns dissolve. This is not regression, it is rebirth. Reclaiming power requires confronting the shadow, the empath's shadow, not the world's, and the empath's shadow is often filled with repressed anger, forgotten boundaries, suppressed désir, and the deep fear of being misunderstood or abandoned. Many empaths believe their sensitivity is their burden, but I tell you, it is their unintegrated shadow that burdens them, not their sensitivity. Sensitivity is a gift, a perceptive organ of the psyche that allows them to see, feel, and know more than most. But when it is fused with unhealed wounds, it becomes porous. When it is fused with self-knowledge, it becomes a sword. The reclaiming of power is the moment the empath stops apologizing for their depth. They stop shrinking so others will not feel small. They stop cushioning themselves so others will not feel exposed. They stop abandoning themselves to prevent others from abandoning them. This is not an act of rebellion, it is an act of psychological maturation. The empath finally understands that the world will not collapse if they remain whole. In fact, the world recalibrates around their wholeness. I have seen this pattern countless times. The empath, after doing the inner work, begins to attract individuals who meet them with clarity rather than confusion, with presence rather than avoidance, with integrity rather than chaos. They begin to draw in souls who do not fear their depth, but are nourished by it. The rare individuals who can stand in the presence of such authenticity feel magnetized, not because they need the empath, but because they recognize something familiar, their own capacity for depth. Attraction becomes resonance, not dependency. It becomes recognition, not compensation. But here is the profound truth. Most empaths do not realize their power does not come from resisting the world, but from integrating themselves. And when integration occurs, attraction is no longer something that happens to them. It becomes something that emanates from them. A new archetypal pattern emerges: the empath as sovereign, the empath as oracle, the empath as self-possessed seer. They no longer enter relationships hoping to heal or be healed. They enter relationships to experience mutual evolution. And the world feels this shift immediately in the collective unconscious. Every transformation of the individual affects the whole. The empath's reclamation of power sends ripples through their family system, their society, their ancestral lineage. They break patterns that have been repeated for generations. They rewrite unconscious contracts that once dictated attraction for centuries. They become, in essence, a living symbol of individuation, a human being who has chosen alignment with the self over the seduction of the familiar wound. There is more to say, much more, for we must explore how the inner child of the empath shapes attraction, how the archetype of the wounded healer transforms into the archetype of wholeness, how the shadow becomes an ally rather than a saboteur, and how psychic energy reorganizes when one no longer seeks validation through self-abandonment. We must delve into dreams, into symbolic imagery, into the alchemical processes that occur when one confronts the depths of their own soul. But for now, let this be the foundation. When the empath reclaims their power. The world responds not gradually, but instantly, for the psyche does not wait for the ego. It moves at the speed of truth. When the empath begins to reclaim their power, a profound inner reversal takes place, almost as though the axis upon which their life once turned has silently shifted. What they used to seek in others, they begin to discover within themselves. What once terrified them, the possibility of disappointing others, of being misunderstood, of standing alone, begins to feel strangely liberating. This shift is not a sudden strike of lightning, rather, it unfolds like a subtle realignment of the soul's compass. The direction of their longing changes. The magnetic pull of the past weakens, and in its place, a new force emerges, something that resonates deeply with the archetype of individuation. But to understand this transformation, we must look beneath the surface of personality and into the architecture of the unconscious, where these patterns take root. The empath is often born into an environment where their emotional attunement becomes a survival strategy. They learn to read the moods of caregivers, to sense the slightest shifts in the emotional climate, to anticipate the needs of others before those needs are spoken. Sensitivity for them is not simply a trait, it becomes a psychic radar attuned to danger, conflict, or unmet expectations. And so they grow up with an internal template that says love is earned through self-sacrifice. Peace is gained through emotional labor, and worth is proven through invisibility. When the empath reclaims their power, they do not merely shed this template, they rewrite it. And the rewriting often begins in the shadow, that dark inner realm where the rejected, silenced, and forbidden parts of the psyche dwell. The empath, in truth, has a vast shadow, much larger than they realize. It contains not only their unhealed wounds, but also their suppressed strength, their buried instincts, their unclaimed authority. Many empaths believe their shadow contains only softness, fragility, or emotional pain. But I tell you, the shadow of the empath is a sleeping giant. It holds the very power they once feared to use. I once worked with a woman whose empathic nature had defined her entire life. She had spent decades trying to save others' partners, family members, friends, with the unconscious belief that saving them would secure her place in their hearts. But the more she gave, the more she disappeared, the more she offered, the less she was valued. She came to me exhausted, depleted, convinced that her sensitivity was her curse. But in her dreams, a different story was being told night after night. She dreamed of a lion pacing behind an iron gate. She feared the lion, for its power felt uncontrollable. Yet at the same time, she felt drawn to it, as if it held something she had lost. One night, the dream changed. The gate was open. The lion walked toward her. not with aggression, but with regal calm. And instead of running, she placed her hand on its mane. When she awoke, she understood. The lion was her shadow, her strength, her authority, her ability to confront rather than comply. She had spent her whole life fearing this inner lion, believing its power would make her unlovable, but reclaiming it did not make her harsh. It made her whole. Such is the journey of the empath, reclaiming their power. The shadow is not something to be defeated. It is something to be integrated. And when it is integrated, attraction changes because the empath is no longer broadcasting a fragmented signal. They are no longer seeking in others what they have denied in themselves. They begin to attract relationships that align with their newfound wholeness rather than their hidden wounds. But let us go deeper still, for there is a mystery at the heart of this transformation that deserves exploration. The empath's relationship with loneliness. Loneliness, for the empath, is not merely a feeling. It is an archetypal experience, a rite of passage, a symbolic descent into the underworld of the self. Many empaths fear solitude because solitude confronts them with the parts of themselves they have avoided by focusing on others. Yet in this loneliness lies the key to their power. When the empath finally stops using relationships as a way to escape themselves, they begin to hear the voice of the self, that quiet, enduring presence that has always been there beneath the noise. This voice does not shout. It whispers of boundaries that honor the soul. It whispers of desires that were silenced long ago. It whispers of calling, purpose, destiny. And the empath begins to realize that what they once mistook for abandonment was actually an invitation to return home to themselves. And when they accept this invitation, attraction recalibrates instantly because they are no longer trying to fill an inner void through outer connections. I have often said that the most dangerous individuals, psychologically speaking, are those who do not know their own shadow. But the most powerful individuals are those who have entered the shadow willingly and returned with its gifts. The empath, when empowered, becomes one of the most magnetic beings in the collective psyche, because they have mastered both sensitivity and strength. They have learned to feel deeply without drowning, to give without losing themselves, to love without abandoning their own center. This integration creates a presence that others feel instinctively. But here is the paradox: when the empath reclaims their power, they become less available to those who once depended on their emotional labor. They stop playing the rescuer in relationships. They stop tolerating disrespect under the guise of compassion. They stop over-explaining themselves in an attempt to avoid conflict. This shift confuses those who once relied on the empath's compliance. They may even accuse the empath of becoming cold, distant, or selfish. Yet, this accusation reveals something profound. Those individuals were never drawn to the empath's soul. They were drawn to the empath's servitude. When the empath steps into alignment with their self, they disrupt the unconscious bargains that once defined their relationships. They no longer play the role of the mirror in which others see only what they want to see. They become a true mirror, one that reflects reality without distortion. And not everyone is ready to face themselves in such a mirror. Some will turn away. Others will try to break the mirror. But those who are whole within themselves will be drawn closer, recognizing in the empath not a healer to exploit, but a partner to evolve with. Attraction that is born from wounds fades quickly. Attraction that is born from wholeness creates a field of resonance that feels ancient, sacred, unmistakably real. It is not the fire that consumes, but the fire that illuminates. It does not twist the soul, it awakens it. And this awakening often feels like recognition not of the other person, but of oneself reflected in another. There is a particular archetype that emerges when the empath reclaims their power, the sovereign empath. This archetype holds the ability to see deeply without absorbing pain, to understand without merging, to love without losing shape. It is an archetype that commands respect not through dominance, but through presence. And it is this archetype that shifts attraction instantly. People feel it when the empath walks into a room. They sense a clarity, a groundedness, a quiet authority that is not performed but embodied. This embodiment does not come from external achievement or social validation. It comes from a deep internal reconciliation with the shadow. The empath no longer fears their anger, so they no longer attract those who provoke it. They no longer fear abandonment, so they no longer attract those who weaponize distance. They no longer fear rejection, so they no longer chase those who withhold affection. The psyche organizes itself around the fear that governs it. Remove the fear, integrate the shadow, reclaim the power, and the psyche reorganizes around the self instead. And when the psyche reorganizes around the self, everything changes. The empath no longer waits to be chosen. They choose. They no longer ask if they are enough. They know they are whole. They no longer shrink to fit into the smallness of others. They expand into the fullness of themselves. And the world adjusts, attraction adjusts, destiny adjusts. We must now look at the deeper symbolism behind this shift, the alchemy of psychic energy that transforms the empath from a vessel of emotional absorption into a vessel of emotional clarity. But that exploration belongs to the next part of our journey. There comes a moment in the empath's individuation where the energy that once flowed outward, constantly seeking soothing, anticipating, begins to turn inward, not as withdrawal, but as reclamation. This inward turn is not an escape from the world, it is a return to the inner kingdom they had unknowingly abandoned. Many empaths fear this shift because it feels unfamiliar, almost disloyal, as if self-focus were a betrayal of their nature. But it is not betrayal, it is awakening. The psyche has grown tired of scattering itself across the emotional landscapes of others. It calls itself home. As this inward movement occurs, something extraordinary begins to surface. The empath starts to sense the subtle layers of their own psyche that were previously overshadowed by their hyper-attunement to external energies. They realize that beneath a soft, gentle persona, they have cultivated lies, a reservoir of instinct, intuition, and ancient knowing that pulses with the intelligence of generations. This intelligence has always been present, but it was drowned out by the empath's devotion to external harmony. Now the empath begins to hear it. This inner voice does not speak in words, but in symbols, dreams, synchronicities. Those seemingly random moments that strike with uncanny significance. The empath finds that their dreams grow more vivid, more archetypal. They encounter figures in the dream realm who represent not merely personal experiences, but collective forces. A child crying in a dark room may symbolize their neglected inner child. A shadowy figure stalking them may represent repressed aggression. A wise old woman or man may manifest as the archetype of the sage, guiding them toward wholeness. These dreams are not fantasies. They are maps, maps of the psyche unfolding. I recall a man who lived his entire life as a sensitive caretaker, always placing others first. He dreamed repeatedly of a great mountain he attempted to climb. Each time he climbed, the mountain grew steeper, the air thinner, and just as he approached the summit, a blinding light forced him to descend once more. When he finally asked the light who it was, a voice replied, "I am your purpose, but you cannot see me while you are carrying others." He awoke trembling, for he understood his life had been spent climbing other people's mountains, carrying their burdens, fulfilling their destinies. Reclaiming his power meant climbing his own mountain at last. This is the turning point for many empaths. They realized that they were never meant to be the emotional scaffolding for others. They were meant to become the vessel through which consciousness itself awakens. Once they begin to honor this calling, the transformation of their relational patterns becomes inevitable. Attraction recalibrates, not because the empath wills it, but because the soul demands it. The psyche cannot maintain relationships that contradict its evolution. Anything misaligned begins to dissolve, sometimes gently, sometimes abruptly. People fall away, not because the empath pushed them, but because they no longer fit the frequency of the empath's emerging truth. And here lies a truth often misunderstood. When the empath reclaims their power, they may go through a period of emotional shedding, almost like a snake shedding its old skin. This shedding can feel lonely, disorienting, even frightening, but it is necessary, for the empath is outgrowing the relational contracts formed in earlier stages of unconsciousness. The individuals who are drawn to their wounds cannot accompany them into their wholeness. The empath is stepping into a new psychic landscape where attraction operates according to resonance, not need. and resonance cannot be faked. What many empaths do not realize is that their reclaimed power emits a silent but potent field around them. It is as though they begin to walk with an invisible aura of clarity. Those who are lost or chaotic feel exposed in their presence, not because the empath judges them, but because the empath's energy no longer cushions them from themselves. Those who are manipulative feel strangely powerless, for the empath's boundaries no longer contain cracks in which manipulation can root itself. Those who seek depth feel immediately drawn in, sensing that something ancient and sincere resides within the empath, a stillness that whispers truth without speaking. But attraction in this new phase becomes something the empath must learn to navigate consciously. They find themselves attracting individuals who resonate with their light but also with their depth, those who see not their softness but their strength, not their vulnerability but their essence. This can feel unfamiliar, even intimidating. For the first time, the empath meets people who do not approach them as caretakers or emotional sanctuaries, but as equals, equals in consciousness, equals in self-awareness, equals in soul maturity. This level of attraction requires the empath to stand in their authenticity without shrinking, which for many is the final frontier of individuation. The empath must confront an uncomfortable truth sometimes. They were afraid not of being unseen, but of being fully seen. Their softness was safe, their service was safe, but their power, their depth, their clarity, these qualities reveal their true nature. And being known in this way requires vulnerability of an entirely different order. Yet the psyche cannot reclaim power without permitting such vulnerability. It is not the vulnerability of weakness, but the vulnerability of truth. There is no greater courage. Let us explore the deeper symbolic implications of this transformation, for the empath's reclamation of power is not merely personal, it is archetypal. It mirrors the ancient myth of the descent into the underworld, the hero who must leave the familiar world behind, confront the shadow, retrieve the lost treasure of the soul, and return transformed. For the empath, the lost treasure is their sovereignty, the inner authority they relinquished long ago in exchange for belonging. In reclaiming it, they become a new version of themselves, not the gentle caretaker, not the emotional sponge, but the integrated self. From this integrated self emerges a new kind of attraction, one that operates according to the laws of the self rather than the needs of the ego. This attraction is not frantic, but calm, not desperate, but discerning. It does not grasp or chase. It simply recognizes. It recognizes the presence of another soul who is also descended, also confronted their shadow, also reclaimed their own truth. Between such souls, attraction does not ignite like wildfire. It unfolds like the sunrise, inevitable, gentle, illuminating everything it touches. In this state of integration, The empath begins to perceive others not through the lens of their wounds, but through the clarity of their intuition. They are no longer seduced by intensity mistaken for connection, nor by chaos mistaken for passion. They can see through charm without being captivated by it, through need without being obligated by it. Attraction becomes an act of recognition rather than projection. The empath recognizes themselves in another's eyes, not the version of themselves they abandoned, but the version they have recovered. And here, something remarkable happens. The empath, who once feared being too much, begins to understand that they were never too much. They were merely too deep for those swimming in shallow waters. The empath, who once feared being alone, begins to realize that solitude was the very container in which their strength was being forged. The empath, who once believed they had to earn love, begins to understand that love rooted in truth cannot be earned, it can only be met. Attraction recalibrates instantly because truth recalibrates instantly. When the empath becomes truthful with themselves, utterly, fearlessly truthful, only those who can meet that truth remain in orbit. Others drift away. And this drift is not loss, it is alignment. The empath is no longer trying to hold together relationships built on unequal exchanges of energy. They are no longer trying to sustain dynamics that sabotage their evolution. They no longer confuse familiarity with destiny. There is something sacred in this new field of attraction, something that feels both ancient and futuristic, as if the empath is stepping into a timeline that was always waiting for them, a timeline where relationships are not about survival but expansion, not about healing wounds but igniting purpose, not about compensating for emptiness but celebrating fullness. And in this timeline, attraction becomes a guide, a compass pointing not to comfort but to evolution. But to fully understand where this leads, we must now explore the alchemical shift in psychic energy, the transformation of eros itself, and the emergence of the sovereign empath as a force of consciousness in the modern world. That is where our journey continues. To understand the empath transformation at this stage, one must enter the domain where psychology meets alchemy, where the movements of the soul reflect themselves in the invisible chemistry of attraction. When an empath reclaims their power, the shift is not merely emotional, it is energetic, archetypal, mythic. It is the transformation of eros itself, the soul's longing for connection, meaning, and wholeness. In its unhealed state, eros pulls the empath towards the familiar pain of childhood, towards the wounds that shaped their identity, but in its integrated state, eros becomes a force of evolution, drawing the empath not toward what broke them, but toward what builds them. This shift can feel as if the entire internal compass has been remagnetized. The empath begins to sense that what once pulled them now repels them, and what once repelled them now calls to them. They may find themselves suddenly uninterested in emotional chaos. no longer moved by the seductive intensity of wounded souls seeking refuge, they may feel an unexpected attraction to slowness, stability, and clarity, qualities that once seemed foreign, even uncomfortable, because they did not mirror the emotional turbulence of the empath's early life. This discomfort is a sign of healing. What once felt exciting was trauma masquerading as destiny. What now feels calm is truth revealing itself quietly. This is the stage where the empath begins to confront one of the most profound realizations of the individuating psyche, that they have mistaken resonance for obligation and intuition for responsibility. They believed that sensing someone's pain meant they were meant to heal it. They believed that seeing into someone's darkness meant they were destined to carry the torch into it. But now, standing in their reclaimed power, they understand that awareness does not imply duty, insight does not require sacrifice. The ability to see someone clearly does not obligate them to enter that person's labyrinth. This realization reorganizes their entire relational universe. The empath, who once absorbed the emotions of others, begins to let them pass through without attachment. They feel deeply, yet remain anchored. They sense nuance, yet remain sovereign. They understand without merging. This is the alchemy of emotional transmutation, sensitivity without self-loss. And it is at this stage that attraction shifts from unconscious repetition to conscious recognition. The empath begins to attract souls who do not seek to drain their energy but to meet it. Souls who recognize not their wounds but their wholeness. Let us explore what this does to the empath's psychic field. Imagine a lake once disturbed by every passing wind, every thrown stone, its surface constantly rippled, its depth unsettled. This was the empath before their power returned open, receptive, absorbing every disturbance in their environment. Now imagine the same lake after it discovers its center. The surface still feels the wind, still receives the falling stone, but it no longer defines itself by these disturbances. It knows its depth, it knows its stillness, it knows that the ripples pass, but its essence remain unmoved. This internal stillness is what others begin to feel when they encounter the empowered empath. It is not emotional hardness, but emotional clarity. This clarity has a curious effect. It reveals the truth in others with startling immediacy. People who approach the empath now find themselves disarmed because the empath's presence reflects their authenticity rather than their persona. For some, this is comforting. For others, it is terrifying. Those who are willing to confront their inner world feel safe with the empowered empath, as though they have finally met someone who does not fear depth. Those who avoid themselves feel exposed, as though standing before a mirror that reveals what they have long tried to escape. The empath is not doing anything. They are simply being, but their beingness becomes a catalyst. And so attraction begins to sort itself, not through effort, but through resonance. A person who is aligned with their own truth feels drawn to the empath's quiet authority. Their presence feels like a sanctuary, not because the empath provides comfort, but because they provide clarity. But those who rely on manipulation, confusion, or emotional dependency feel repelled. The empath's reclaimed power deprives them of the fertile ground in which their patterns once thrived. There is no longer a crack through which their shadow can enter, and so they drift away. The empath may feel guilt in this stage, for they are accustomed to taking responsibility for the emotional well-being of others. But this guilt is the residue of an outdated identity. As they release it, their psyche stabilizes, their relationships evolve, their boundaries become natural rather than effortful. They no longer say no with fear, they say no with truth. And this truth becomes a kind of magnet, attracting those who live by it and repelling those who fear it. What fascinates me most is how the empath's relationship with desire changes at this stage. Before reclaiming their power, desire was entangled with longing for approval, for validation, for recognition. Desire was shaped by emptiness, but after the transformation, desire becomes an expression of fullness. The empath begins to want not from lack, but from abundance. They desire connection that expands rather than contracts. They desire relationships that elevate rather than entangle. They desire souls who see them not as a source of emotional nourishment, but as a partner in consciousness. This new desire operates not on the level of craving, but on the level of calling. It feels less like hunger and more like recognition, as if something ancient has been remembered rather than discovered. This recognition is a hallmark of individuated attraction. It is not the nervous flutter of insecurity, nor the intoxicating chaos of trauma-bonded desire. It is calm, inevitable, grounded. It feels like stepping into a room and instantly knowing where you belong. It feels like meeting someone whose presence feels like an echo of your own truth. At this stage, the empath begins to see attraction, not as a mystery but as a language. They understand that the soul speaks through resonance, through energy rather than emotion, through symbols rather than sensation. They learn to read this language not with their heart alone, but with their entire being. And in reading it, they become an interpreter of their own destiny. Yet, this shift is not without challenge. The empath may find themselves tested as old patterns reappear, not to trap them, but to confirm the solidity of their transformation. Someone from the past may return, offering familiarity, but not alignment. The empath may feel the pull of nostalgia, the echo of old wounds, but standing in their reclaimed power, they recognize that returning to the past is returning to a version of themselves they have already outgrown. The test is not to resist temptation, but to recognize truth. And truth, once seen, cannot be unseen. This is where the empath begins to understand the true nature of power. Not power over others, but power over one's own inner world. The ability to choose without fear, the ability to love without losing oneself, the ability to walk away without collapsing, the ability to stand alone without feeling abandoned. This is the power the world feels when it meets the transformed empath. It is subtle, yet unmistakable. It is quiet, yet unshakable. It is soft, yet utterly untouchable. And here lies the most profound mystery of all. As the empath steps fully into this power, they become deeply attractive, not because they seek attention, but because they radiate authenticity. They emit a frequency of truth so rare in the modern world that others cannot help but feel pulled toward it. This attraction is not about beauty, charm, or personality. It is the attraction of alignment, the gravitational pull of a soul in its rightful place. But to understand the full scope of this attraction, we must now explore the final alchemical transformation. What happens when the empath becomes not merely whole but creative, generative, sovereign, when their reclaimed power becomes a force that reshapes not only their relationships but their destiny. That is where we will continue. As the empath continues their inward journey, a profound creative impulse begins to emerge, an impulse that was always present but long suppressed beneath layers of self-sacrifice.